Hello, everybody. I've got here Chapter 40 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Cassandra changed her aim point as the attacker advanced across the bridge. She whirled the sling one more time as he moved tentatively above the yawning gap, then released. The shot slammed into his left knee with a sickening crack, smashing bone and tendons. The knee gave way beneath him, and he slumped to one side, releasing his grip on the spear as he hung over the edge of the 7-story drop, scrabbling frantically at the rough wood to recover, and failing. With a horrible scream, he fell into the gap beside the makeshift bridge, plummeting down into the darkness, screaming all the way until they could hear a distant, ugly thump. The scream was cut off. The door in the barrier slammed shut once more. The next man in line had seen his comrade's fate and wasn't prepared to risk the crossing. Cassandra heard a raised voice shouting orders. Damone, she realized. More smoke pots. Get more of the pots up here. If they can't see us, they can't shoot us. The smoke was clearing in the upper part of the stairway now, although the defender's eyes still smarted and ran with tears. The open door had created a draft to let the dense, choking clouds out. There was a brief lull, and she heard feet running on the stairs below her. Presumably men were fetching more of the smoke pots. Merlin pointed to the replacement bridge. Could we maybe burn it, my lady? She considered the idea, but shook her head. It was solid timber. It would take too long to get it burning, she said, and I doubt they'd leave us in peace while we did it. Some of Damone's men had bows, she knew. They might not be as skilled as her archers, but at close quarters like this, they could hardly miss. There was a flash of flint on steel in the dimness on the other side of the barrier. They're lighting the fuses, she said. Everyone get ready. She removed her scarf and wrapped it round her nose and mouth. Turning to the youngest of the troopers standing ready, she pointed up the stairs. Fetch scarves and kerchiefs for everyone, and a bucket of water to soak them. Wet scarves round their noses and mouths might help against the choking smoke, she thought. He nodded and turned, running lightly up the stairs. She heard Damone issuing orders once more. Don't throw them too far. Try to lob them close to the end of the bridge. That would concentrate the smoke where they stood waiting, she realized, and create better cover for the men crossing the bridge. She loaded her sling again and let it dangle down beside her, swinging back and forth like a snake's head as it prepared to strike. The first of the clay pots sailed over the gap, hitting the stairway 4 steps above the bridge. Before it could ignite the oil and pitch inside, however, Merlin reached out with his pike and scooped it down the stairs, sending it tumbling into the gap. But his action came at a cost. Even as she began to congratulate him, he gave a gasp of pain and dropped the pike, clutching at his upper arm where a crossbow bolt had struck him. He sank awkwardly to the stairs. She reached out, grabbing his jerkin, and within the strength of desperation, heaved him back into cover as another bolt ricocheted off the step behind him. He screamed in pain as she dragged him in, but managed to gasp his thanks, realizing she had saved his life. Think nothing of it, she said. We need you. Another smoke pot flew over the gap. This one went too high and smashed on the stairs above them. The resultant cloud of smoke billowed up, but someone had had the intelligence to open the doorway on the floor above them, and most of the smoke was sucked upward by the draft. The young soldier had returned now, with scarves and kerchiefs and a large bucket full of water. He began to distribute the wet cloths to the defenders, who wrapped them round their noses and mouths. He was just in time, as another 2 smoke pots crashed onto the steps. These were better aimed, and they hit the stonework level with Cassandra's position. She hastily dipped her scarf into the bucket and retied it. The wet cloth filtered the smoke to a certain extent, but her eyes were still smarting and weeping, and she found it hard to see. One of the pots had deposited its load of oil and pitch only a few meters from her. The young trooper seized the bucket, still half full, and dumped the water onto the burning pitch, smothering the flames. "Good thinking," she croaked. Then she gestured upward to the doorway. "Get more water. Get a bucket chain going." He nodded, his own eyes red and weeping, and darted away to do her bidding. The flames close by her had only been temporarily doused, more by the sheer impact of the water cutting off the air to them than by the extinguishing properties of the water itself. They flickered to life once more, feeding off the pitch, and began to generate more smoke. Through streaming, reddened eyes, she saw the gate in the barrier opening again, and another enemy soldier advanced through it. At least, she thought the bridge was so narrow it would permit only one man at a time to cross. But if any of them gained a foothold on this side of the gap, she and her men would be in trouble. She whirled her sling and launched a shot at the man, but he was crouched low behind his shield and didn't offer her a convenient target. The shot hit his shield with a vicious thud. He was stopped by the impact for a second. Then he continued to advance. 2 more smoke pots soared across the gap, shattering and adding their billowing fumes to the hellish scene in the stairwell. 3 arrows slammed into the man's shield, and he stopped uncertainly. The narrow bridge didn't provide the most stable footing, and crossing it in the current conditions, while being targeted by archers and with visibility uncertain, required enormous concentration. "Step aside, my lady," said a hoarse voice behind her. She turned and saw one of her men, a tall, broad-shouldered corporal, standing ready with a heavy spear. His eyes were fixed on the enemy soldier, now 2/3 of the way across the bridge, advancing slowly. Cassandra moved to one side to give him room. He took the spear back over his right shoulder, eyes still fixed on his target, and stepping forward, made his cast. The spear flashed through the dark smoke and bit deeply into the man's lower leg. He let out a scream of pain and stopped, dropping to a crouch. He released his hold on his battle-axe and clutched at the wound in his leg. The heavy spear shaft dangled over the drop, unbalancing him and trying to drag him after it. He tried to pull the spear loose, but couldn't manage it. He was stuck, unable to stand again, swaying fearfully over the gap, while arrows hissed round his ears and slammed into the timber bridge below him. Holding his shield in front of him, he began to back clumsily away on the bridge, propelling himself with his free hand and his uninjured leg. His shield was now festooned with arrow shafts, as the archers maintained a constant barrage on him. Crossbow bolts whirred among the gap in return, and Cassandra heard a shout of pain from the stairs above her, as at least one found its mark. A lucky shot, she thought. Visibility was as poor for the attackers as the defenders. The air over the bridge was relatively clear, kept so by the draft coming up the gap in the stairwell. But everywhere else, the fumes and smoke made it almost impossible to find a target. The wounded man made it back to the safety of the lower edge of the gap and slumped back against the barrier's closed gate. He still kept his shield in front of him, protecting himself from the steady rain of arrows that continued to thud into the wood and hide shield. Blood poured from the spear wound in his leg. An arrow hit him on his right arm, and he flinched and cried out. But his voice was weak, and Cassandra realized that loss of blood was weakening him. Abruptly, the gate slammed open, and several pairs of hands grabbed at him, dragging him back into safety, accompanied by another hail of arrows flashing through the open gate. Cassandra studied the temporary bridge for several minutes, then flicked her gaze to the pike that Merlin had dropped. For the time being, both sides had stopped shooting, with no targets visible for either her archers or Damon's crossbowmen. Earlier, Cassandra and her men had tried to push the bridge back across the gap, but the transverse beam, nailed in place a meter from its end, locked against the lip of the stairs and kept it from moving. But there was no similar beam at the upper end of the bridge, she realized, so there was nothing to stop them from pulling the timber structure up the stairs. She turned to look behind her, coughing, as an eddy of smoke whirled around her. The heavy-set tall soldier who had thrown the spear was still close by. He'd do admirably for what she had in mind, she thought. She beckoned him forward, and as he knelt beside her, gestured to the fallen pike on the steps. The pike was a combination of different weapons. Mounted on a stout ash shaft, 2.5 meters long, it had an axe head on one side, a spear point at the top, and a vicious spike opposite the axe head. "See the pike?" she said. The man nodded, and she pointed to the bridge. "When I give the word, drive the spike into the timbers and drag the bridge up toward us. Understand?" The man nodded, smiling as he caught on to her idea. If he could haul the bridge up far enough, the bottom end of its 2 main beams would slip off the edge of the steps, and the entire structure would plunge into the gap. He started to move forward, but she gripped his arm to stop him. "Wait till we get some cover for you," she said. Then, calling to the archers a few steps higher than she was, she gave her orders. "Archers, rapid shooting, keep their heads down." Arrows started to fly across the gap once more in a steady stream. There were no visible targets, but the iron warheads screeched off the curved stone walls of the stairwell, striking sparks in the gloom as they did. Several arrows slammed into the wood of the barrier, but most skimmed over the top, ricocheting off the walls beyond, sometimes shattering the shafts and sending the razor-sharp broadheads spinning wildly through the air. They heard at least one hoarse yell of pain, which indicated that a broadhead had found a target. But the sudden arrow storm had the desired result. The attackers on the lower part of the stairway dropped to their bellies, hands over their heads, while the arrows hissed and spun and screeched among them. She released her grip on the soldier's muscular arm. "Now," she told him, and he lunged forward, gathering in the pike as he went. Then, from a kneeling position, he raised it over his head in a 2-handed grip and brought it down with all his strength, driving the long spike into the timber planking of the bridge. Once it was set, he gathered his feet under him and began to heave the bridge forward, slowly, a few centimeters at a time. As the attackers realized what was happening, she saw hands scrabbling desperately under the barrier, trying to seize hold of the bridge and stop it. She darted out into the open, grabbing hold of the soldier's belt and adding her strength to his. Behind her, she felt someone else doing the same to her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the young lad who had fetched the water. "Heave!" she shouted. "Keep it moving!" Under their combined strength, the long structure slid upward until its lower end slid off the step below them. Then it pitched up vertically and disappeared into the gap, taking the pike with it. The 3 of them released their grip and staggered backwards on the stairs. For a moment, they listened to the clatter of the bridge falling into the darkness below, bouncing off walls, the noise gradually dying away. The archers on the stairs gave a ragged cheer as Cassandra and her 2 companions dragged themselves back into cover. Breathless, she sprawled on the stone steps with them, grinning triumphantly. She shook her head angrily. So much for Damon's word. She had let him lull her into a feeling of false security, assuming he would hold off until the 24-hour period, and the implied truce that went with it, were over. He had caught her napping, and his attempt had come close to succeeding. She realized that she couldn't let her guard down again. All right, that's going to be the conclusion of chapter number 40. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next time in chapter 41. God bless, and have a good one.